Dr. Michael Wagner, it's a real privilege and honor to have you here. You're very well respected in the province of Alberta and have been for many years. For a long time, you were a bit of a lone voice, or you were one of the main voices that talked about why Alberta as a province should leave Canada. Just a little bit of my background. I'm a second-generation Canadian. My father was born in Slovakia. My mother's family were actually coming from Russia. There were Germans from Russia. My grandfather, grandmother, and two siblings escaped Stalin's people. My great aunt came pregnant, having been raped by a Bolshevik soldier. So they came in January 1921 off a boat as refugees, and we've gone on from there. So I was steeped in loving Canada, being very grateful to the Queen of England and having regard for God. So the thought of being unpatriotic to either Canada or the Queen of England was tied so closely to God they wouldn't come apart. But I worked around a lot of separatists and I understood the whys of what they were saying. It just wasn't here. So tell us about what you were speaking of, about the whys for these many years. A voice crying in the wilderness, so to speak.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to acknowledge the conception of Canada that you're talking about as something that was great in the past. Canada was great. Canada offered freedom to so many millions of people, even to my ancestors who came to the prairies a little bit before yours. So there is much to appreciate about Canada, and especially the past. The Canada that I was born into was a wonderful freedom-loving country of prosperity with reasonably good government compared to other countries of the world. But Canada has changed, and that's one of the fundamental things. The Canada that we live in today is not the Canada that gave refuge to our ancestors, because there have been significant changes, especially, again, with Pierre Trudeau. Now, when we look at the history of the prairies, there's always been discontent with central Canada right from the very beginning. So in the early decades of the 20th century, you'd have reform movements spring up looking for political reform, especially in the form of alternative political parties. Westerners, and especially Albertans, rejected the mainstream political parties. You know, during the 1920s, Alberta had a United Farmers of Alberta government.
Yes.
And federally, the main party in Alberta at that time was the Progressive Party of Canada, which was a farmers' party based mostly in the West. So the West would fight back against Central Canada through different political movements. So there was this discontent. It wasn't a real happy relationship with the East, but things weren't really, really bad in the sense that they became. Now, so the idea of Alberta becoming its own country, or the West becoming its own country, didn't really take off until Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I say, there was discontent. You can find discontent on the prairies all the way from the very beginning.
Okay.
But you can't find a movement for independence until Pierre Trudeau becomes Prime Minister.
What year was that?
Well, he became Prime Minister in 1968.
Okay.
And so the first kind of a formative separatist movement began in 1970. So the early part of the separatist movement resulted from Trudeau adopting the Official Languages Act, which made French much more prominent across Canada and on the prairies. And some people on the prairies saw it as having French thrust down their throat.
Yes.
So that was kind of the initial stage of the movement, but it was still very, very small at that time.
Okay.
It began to get legs in 1973 because there was a war in the Middle East, which led to the price of oil skyrocketing.
And then OPEC.
Yeah, well, OPEC was part of that, yes.
Okay.
See, there was a war in the Middle East, Israel against Arab countries.
Okay.
And so the West, many of the Western countries were supporting Israel. So Arab countries and OPEC would cut off oil to Western countries.
Yes.
And that lack of supply led to a skyrocketing of the oil price.
Gotcha.
So up until that time, the price of oil was about $3 a barrel. Like it was a good resource for Alberta to have, but it wasn't the jewel that would be later. So the price of oil went from about $3 a barrel to about $12 a barrel in just a few weeks. So suddenly, Alberta was about to reap huge amounts of money from its oil.
Sure.
But Pierre Trudeau, as Prime Minister, he put an export tax on Alberta's oil. So when Alberta was exporting oil to the United States, and we were going to get all this money from that, but the federal government would take a huge percentage of the oil, of the money that Alberta should get for exporting its oil. That was unprecedented in Canadian history at that time.
Yes.
And our Premier, Peter Lougheed, called it the biggest ripoff in Confederation's history, because we weren't getting the money for our provincial resource, like the oil is provincial resource.
And let's just clarify that. Oil is a provincial resource, not a federal resource.
Exactly. And so the export tax on oil was unfair to Alberta because the federal government was taking money that Alberta deserved. And there was one other thing.
That Alberta had a right?
That Alberta had an absolute right to. The other thing was, like, Alberta sold a lot of oil within Canada itself, and Trudeau mandated a lower price for Canadian oil than the world price. So when Alberta sold its oil within Canada, we didn't get the world price. When we exported the oil to the United States, we didn't get the world price. We were not getting the price for our oil that we ought to have. So that caused a big uproar in Alberta. And so the first significant separatist organization called the Independent Alberta Association was formed in 1974, with oilmen and professionals. Now, it didn't get a lot of traction at that time, but it did have a public face to it, and they would conduct studies to show, how Alberta would be better off as an independent country. So that's kind of that's how the movement got going. It built a little bit during the 1970s, but still during the 70s, when they did surveys on support for independence, it would be like single-digit support, like 4 or 5 or 6%. And what changed things was in 1980, there was a federal election, and Pierre Trudeau was campaigning to get back as prime minister, and he campaigned against Alberta, essentially telling Canada, vote for me and I'll put Alberta in its place. One of the main Liberal campaign activists at the time was a guy named Keith Davey, who would later become a senator, and he brought in the slogan, screw the West, we'll take the rest.
He literally said that.
Yes, that's a quote from him. So that was their campaign strategy. They'll campaign against the West energy resources, telling Central Canada, we'll get you cheaper oil if you vote us into power. And that's kind of how Trudeau was reelected in 1980 with a majority government, like campaigning. And so people in Western Canada, especially Alberta, were quite upset about that. And so you get the springing up of separatist groups just because of the election. Now, it was a few months later, in October of 1980, he brought in the National Energy Program, which was a federal power grab on Alberta's energy industry.
Yes.
At the time, they said they needed to Canadianize Alberta's oil industry or Canada's oil industry because it was mostly American companies that were running the oil industry. So they said we need to Canadianize it by having more federal government control, and also would give us more energy security. Those were the public reasons they gave. But several years later, Marc Lalonde, who was energy minister, would admit that those weren't the real reasons.
What were the real reasons?
The real reason was the federal government was afraid of Alberta getting too much money and getting too much power through the money from the oil revenue. So the federal government wanted to claw back that money from Alberta, and that was kind of the essential reason for the National Energy Program. So
they want to keep Alberta neutered.
Yeah, they want to keep Alberta down and give that money to the federal government.
Right.
So what happened with the National Energy Program is that many people lost their jobs. I mean, it was very much a strike against the oil industry.
Homes.
Yes. People lost their jobs, their homes, their businesses. It was very harmful for thousands of Albertans, and the Alberta economy began to go down. Now, later on, a year or so later, there would be a drop in the oil price that would lead to a general recession in Alberta, but the problems began with the National Energy Program. Like leftists will say, it's the recession that led to the problems, not the National Energy Program. But when experts have compared the Canadian energy industry with the American one, they can see an immediate result from the National Energy Program. For example, Texas and Oklahoma did not suffer the same downturn Alberta did in 1980-81 because of the National Energy Program. Later, they would suffer because of the recession and the drop in oil prices. But that was, a year or two later, whereas Alberta suffered it immediately because of the National Energy Program.
And you're saying it was absolutely intentional by Pierre Trudeau to kick Alberta down.
Yes, I would say that exactly. That was intentional. That was his purpose. So, because of that, there was a lot of big separatist meetings. That's when it really began to take off. There was two main organizations, actually. WestFed, led by Elmer Knudsen, and the Western Canada Concept, which was originally founded by Doug Christie.
Okay.
But then an Alberta party, Western Canada Concept of Alberta Party, was founded independently of Doug Christie, and there was conflict with him, and he wasn't part of it. So it was led by other people and run by other people.
Okay.
Now, the WestFed would eventually collapse because of infighting, and the WestFed people would kind of feed into the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta. So then in 1982, as we discussed previously, there was a by-election in Olds Didsbury, and the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta candidate Gordon Kessler won that by-election and became a member of the legislature.
Oh, I've heard it said that the Western Canada Concept failed because it lacked organization after that by-election. Is there truth to that?
I think so. I think there's some truth to that. But also what happened, as what's happened in so many Western separatist organizations, is you get infighting. Mm-hmm. See, they didn't, I can't remember if they didn't have a leader or the leader resigned, but there was a leadership convention afterwards that Gordon Kessler won. But there were some other strong candidates. And, there was kind of factions behind each candidate. So when Gordon Kessler won, some of their factions pulled back, which kind of reduced, the effectiveness and size of the party. Okay. If they'd all kind of pulled in together, it would have been better for the party, and it would have been stronger. And the other thing that happened then was Premier Peter Lougheed called an early provincial election. Like there was still lots of time until the next provincial election would
To head
normally
it
take
off
place.
at the pass.
Exactly. He saw the growth in the Western Canada concept. He saw the infighting. So he decided to call an early provincial election from November 1982 to capitalize on that division and on the, to undermine the growth of support for that. So in 1982, November 1982, there was a provincial election, and the Western Canada concept lost that one seat. Like, it got almost 12% of the provincial vote, which is very significant because it was concentrated largely in rural areas.
Sure.
So in many cases, the Western Canada concept candidate was was second, even potentially close.
Oh.
But they didn't win any seats, which kind of very much hurt the party, but they had a strong vote anyway.
Are you able to tell us what percentage of the vote overall separatism had in that election?
Probably the best we could gather would be the Western Canada concept vote. Like, that 12% was probably that indicated the support for separatism. Okay. But Peter Lougheed, though, was well known as fighting Pierre Trudeau. Like, Peter Lougheed stood up very strongly. So there were people who would have been sympathetic to separatism, but who would look to Peter Lougheed because he was such a strong proponent for defending Alberta and its resources.
He was.
So he did a very good job that way in many respects.
Yes.
There was a few points he could have done better, and that's why the WCC got strong for a while. But Peter Lougheed fought very strong against Pierre Trudeau, and so I think many Albertans wanted to reward Peter Lougheed for what he did. Wow. So he got a massive majority in that election. I think he got at least 60% of the vote, for his party. He did very good, but that really hurt the separatist movement at that time because of the election, like, even eliminated the one WCC MLA that there was. And Pierre Trudeau ended up resigning just a couple of years later and was replaced by John Turner. And then we had a federal election in 1984, and Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives were elected as government. Now, this also hurt the separatist movement in the sense that people in Alberta generally thought that Mulroney was going to be good for us, that he was going to, be much better than Pierre Trudeau and remove the National Energy Program and do other things that are beneficial to the West.
How long did the National Energy Program last?
Well, I guess it was announced in October of 1980. And then when Brian Mulroney came in, I think they probably finally phased out the last of it in 1986.
It's a long time.
It was. And this is one of the complaints actually against Mulroney was, he did put an end to the National Energy Program, but he didn't do it really quickly. He kind of, he could have done it more quickly than he did.
Yeah.
And so people, questioned that, but he did get rid of it, as he said.
Sure.
In 1986, though, there was a very big issue that Mulroney did improperly in the sense of favoring Central Canada over the West. And that was Canada had recently bought CF-18 fighter jets.
Okay.
And it was a very big federal contract to maintain those jets. There was only 2 cities in Canada with the facilities to maintain the jets, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the federal government held a competition to see which city should win the contract. And according to the government's criteria, Winnipeg won the contract, and Brian Mulroney awarded the contract to Montreal.
Oh my goodness.
And so that caused a real big uproar in the West.
Yes.
Obviously, Mulroney was favoring Central Canada. But what was worse than that was that we had voted for Mulroney. We didn't vote for Pierre Trudeau.
Yes.
So when he was attacking us, we always saw him as our enemy. But Brian Mulroney was supposed to be our friend. Every Alberta member of Parliament was Progressive Conservative, and most of the other Prairie MPs were Progressive Conservative as well. So Mulroney was supposed to be our guy. So he stabbed us in the back when he awarded that contract to Montreal. The uproar led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada, which was formed in 1987. Okay. That was kind of the biggest single thing. There were some other underlying factors, but that was the biggest single factor that led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada. Now, the Reform Party of Canada is very important in the history of the West and our politics.
Yes.
Because, Preston Manning, his slogan was "The West wants in." And I think this actually communicates the truest intentions of most Westerners for the entire time we've been part of Canada, that we want our voices heard in the national government. Like, why won't they listen to us?
Yes.
And that's been the problem all along with the policies, whether it's the National Energy Program or the CF-18 or whatever. They don't listen to us. And so Western Canadians would want our voice heard in the national government. And that was the idea of the Reform Party in its inception. The West wants in. Vote for us. We'll go to Ottawa. We'll give you the Western voice. And so, in 1993, there was a federal election. 52 MPs were elected as Reform Party MPs from the West and sent to Ottawa. Here's our guys to go into Ottawa. Now Ottawa will listen to us. No.
A little bit like a Bloc Québécois situation.
Yeah, a lot like that, except for it wasn't. They didn't want the West to leave. They wanted the West's voice in. But,
yes.
But it is a regional representation,
yes.
So that's very much the case. But they didn't want to listen to the Reform Party, and they would just make fun of the Reform Party, just a bunch of Western radicals. Now, the Reform Party itself...
Who's they?
I'm thinking of central Canada, the central Canadian politicians. Like when you look actually at the media, I used to have a book that had political cartoons from Eastern Canada from the time of that 1993 election. And yes, and I don't know what happened to it, but it had political cartoons making fun of the Reform Party. Like if you remember the Beverly Hillbillies TV program, which there was one cartoon of the Reform MPs were like the Beverly Hillbillies riding in this old car.
Oh my goodness.
You know what I mean? It's just really mocking them and making fun of them. Yes. And that was kind of the Eastern establishment view of them, whether it's the media or the political establishment or whatever.
What year is this now?
1993.
1993, 11 years after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came in.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, the Reform Party gradually got the idea that it should become a national party to defeat the Liberals. So to make a long story short, it converted itself into the Canadian Alliance in the year 2000 under Stockwell Day, and they couldn't win then either. So Stephen Harper then became leader after Stockwell Day. He merged the Canadian Alliance with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada. So we lost that party as the Western voice in the sense of the Reform Party.
But did that Western voice remain viable part of the new Conservative Party?
In a sense, kind of in a diluted sense, because, Stephen Harper himself had been a Reform Party MP and one of the founders of the Reform Party. So he actually, at least at one early in his life, he certainly believed in the message of the West wants in. And he did have, some of that was still residual within him as Prime Minister, because as Prime Minister, he did try and make some efforts towards Senate reform. He introduced several bills into the House of Commons and the Senate to make, at least to have consultative elections for the Senate. Like Alberta had a consultative election first in 1989. That was because Premier Don Getty accepted the idea of the Triple E Senate. I guess I should go back a little bit to back in the days of Peter Lougheed fighting Trudeau. Peter Lougheed created a committee to advise this provincial government on what kind of reforms would make Canada more reasonable for Alberta.
Okay.
And to make a long story short, out of that committee came the idea of a Senate that would be elected, because we don't have an elected Senate in Canada. Right. So the senators would be elected. There'd be an equal number from each province rather than disparate numbers which discriminate against the West as it is right now.
Unequal numbers.
Yes, unequal numbers, and they'd have effective powers. So like I'm kind of putting in a nutshell things over a few...
they can do things that really matter.
Right. That's right. Yeah. In Alberta in the early 1980s, we began with the Senate, the Triple E Senate idea, and we ended up with a Canadian committee for the Triple E Senate. So the idea of the Triple E Senate that I just described became very popular in Alberta, and the Alberta government under Don Getty endorsed that idea as a government. And so that's what led to, in October of 1989, Canada's very first Senate election ever. So we had a Senate election in Alberta.
Yes, that's right.
It was won by the Reform Party candidate, General Stan Waters. So he was appointed to the Senate by Brian Mulroney. We've had a few other consultative elections since then. But the point is, the Reform Party was very strongly in support of the Triple E Senate. So we had the Reform Party to represent us in the House of Commons. We had the Triple E Senate movement happening at the same time. Neither of them were able to make the kind of changes we need for Alberta to get our voice heard in the national government. Stephen Harper kept some of those Senate reform ideas with him and tried to bring about a certain degree of Senate reform as Prime Minister. Especially, he wanted consultative elections. So the Prime Minister would be choosing...
For the purpose of electing senators.
That's right. Because like right now, the Prime Minister can choose whoever he wants for Senate.
Yes.
The idea of the consultative elections would be a province would hold an election, and the people who got the most votes would then be submitted to the Prime Minister, and he should select one of those people, one of the elected people, not just someone that he likes personally or who supported his political party.
And that's happened a few times.
Yeah, in Alberta.
In Alberta.
Yeah. We've had that in Alberta a few times, but not in the other provinces.
Right.
And to make a long story short, the Supreme Court slammed the door on that, which Stephen Harper was bringing these bills forward to make these kind of changes in Canada, and Quebec launched a court case, a reference court case, to challenge the constitutionality of the reforms that Stephen Harper wanted. Oh. So Stephen Harper then, kind of to do an end run around the Quebec court case, he launched a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada to get an authoritative decision before Quebec's case could get up to the top. He thought the reason for doing that was so he could be the one asking the questions.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because who asks the questions, that has a big impact on the outcome of the court case.
Okay.
Anyway, to make a long story short, the Supreme Court slammed the door on Senate reform, said it would require a constitutional amendment, even for the kinds of changes that Stephen Harper wanted, which weren't, a full Triple E Senate. So that put an end to the Senate reform movement.
That's because it's so hard to change the Constitution. It's probably impossible.
Probably.
Because it requires...
7 provinces representing at least 50% of the population.
Yes.
As well as the House of Commons, the Senate, to vote in favor of that. So that it's very hard to amend the Constitution in Canada.
Probably impossible.
But But the conclusion of all this, of what I'm trying to say, is the West over several decades has been trying to change the country, trying to reform national institutions so that the West's voice can be heard in the national government.
And because it's decades now, we're talking generational efforts.
Yeah, basically probably a couple of generations.
Yes.
We've been trying to change Canada because I think that's, like I said, I think most Albertans just want the West wants in. They want their voice heard in the national government.
Yes.
But my point is, we've tried that. We've been doing that for decades. And every time the door is closed on us. So if we've tried these several things and they don't work, the only option left is to pursue independence.
Okay, so right there, when did you come to the conclusion in your life the only option is to pursue independence? What year was that?
It's kind of evolving in the sense because,
Sure.
see, I first got involved in politics as a teenager in the early 1980s. Like, my family was not part of the oil industry, and so we weren't personally affected by the National Energy Program.
Okay.
But I was in Calgary at the time going to school, and some of my friends, their families would have been in the oil industry and stuff. So it felt very much like an attack on my community. So I joined the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta in 1982. I mean, I was just a teenager. That election, that November 1982 election, I handed out pamphlets for the WCC. Like, I wasn't old enough to vote. I mean, I was quite naive and stuff, but I was just... I really wanted to defend Alberta. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So during the 1980s, I still kept sympathy for that idea of Alberta becoming independent. But I drifted away from that idea, like many people, during the Reform Party era. And part of that was deliberate, it turns out, on Preston Manning's part. Like, he saw the energy of the separatist movement. He thought if he could bring it into the Reform Party as energy to reform the country, that then we wouldn't need a separatist movement because we'd be part of that national conversation.
Sure, that makes sense.
And so many separatists did join. In fact, when I was a member of the WCC, the last leader was Jack Ramsey. He ended up becoming a Reform Party MP. But that's because the Reform Party did absorb that energy from the independence movement in Alberta.
Yes.
And so the Reform Party seemed like the answer. So during the 90s and into the 2000s, I wasn't part of the independence movement. I mean, there was hardly any independence movement to speak of because so much had been absorbed by the Reform Party. Yeah. So in a sense, I was thinking of that seriously already as a teenager. But more recently, I didn't think of it seriously until after Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015.
Really?
Yeah, right after Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. I probably didn't like him because of his last name, because I didn't like his father.
Right.
But so that didn't help. But then I started reading about some of the policies he wanted to do.
Yes.
And I thought, we really need to do something to defend Alberta and to prevent some of Trudeau's policies from being implemented. And so in 2015, I started seriously thinking and, joining Facebook groups to start with, and then starting to attend some of the small meetings and stuff. So 2015 was a turning point because of the election of Justin Trudeau.
Sure. You've made that decision, and there are many economic reasons why Alberta would be better off separating. Do you agree with those reasons?
Yeah, like probably the top expert on the transfer of Alberta's money to the federal government is a man named Robert Manzel, who's an economist at the University of Calgary.
Okay.
And in 2020, he wrote an essay where he said that he had calculated from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net contribution to Canada of $630 billion. Every year we send some money to the federal government and we get some back in services.
Let's just talk about that because I want to... The phraseology of equalization is a problem because the Alberta government doesn't send the money. The money comes from the taxpayers' pockets, right, straight from the pockets, from payroll to Ottawa. And then Ottawa decides which provinces get what money. So the phraseology of we send money to Ottawa needs to be clarified that it's the tax givers that give the money to Ottawa.
Yeah. And also to clarify along those lines too, like the equalization is part of that transfer, but it's not the whole transfer. There's other government programs.
CPP?
Yeah, exactly. So Robert Manzel likes the term fiscal transfers.
Okay.
He doesn't want to talk about equalization or this transfer, that transfer. He just collects them together as fiscal transfers. So it's a total package of all these different programs. So like you said, every year, the federal government taxes our pockets and we send money there, and they send some back in terms of services and other cash benefits. Yeah. But the net result is that every year there's more given to the federal government than is received back in Alberta. And from 65 until 2018, that's $630 billion.
Amazing.
Now, and from 2018, we've been giving more money since then. So it would actually be between 630, maybe up to 700 billion, over that period of time. So we're losing so much every year. If we become independent, we won't be losing that money.
So overall, two main points that caused you to become an active separatist, and then you spent time explaining to Albertans why. Number one, the historic efforts and the significant efforts of Albertans to become part of Canada and to be continually rebuffed. And secondly, the excessive amounts of money that Albertans send to Ottawa for this fiscal, here's your free fiscal money every year, and let's not get any back or very much back. Is there a way you can summarize this for us as far as why you really believe that Alberta should leave Canada?
Well, actually, like you definitely touched on the two main things, and the former is stronger for me than the latter.
Is it?
I mean, like I've believed off and on over several decades of Alberta, the need for Alberta to become independent. Eventually, through studying these issues, I did come from my personal perspective, the biggest reason Alberta needs to leave is because we don't have another option in terms of our relationship with Central Canada. Okay. We're going to continue to be abused by the federal government unless we pull out. Because
very strong words.
Yes, but we've tried so many other things, and Senate reform makes so much sense. It strikes me as odd that they will just shut the door on that and not even take a serious look at that, because we don't have an elected Senate. What Canadian can justify not electing the officials that make laws for us? Like it's unbelievable. You know what I mean?
Well, now we know from your last interview, it's the judges that are making the laws now. Okay, thank you very much for this really excellent overview of history, really, from the perspective of an Albertan. Michael, once again, I appreciate you being here on Alberta Unfiltered. Thank you very much for listening, and I invite you to like and subscribe, and look forward to hearing from Michael on our third interview.
From the mountains to the prairie sky.